Well, a disturbing development on the border crisis.
Continue to take off the streets the worst of the worst,
resulting in the release of more than 1,700 criminal illegal.
Hi, my name is Christian Maynard, and if you've paid attention to American politics lately, you've probably heard some version of these claims, or even more outlandish claims.
He's the one that killed people with the bad water, including hundreds of thousands of people dying, and also killing our citizens when they come in.
Now, if that were true, it would be one of the largest public safety crises. Hundreds of thousands? That would be catastrophic. But before we let politicians and cable news convince us that we're living through an immigrant crime apocalypse, we should probably do something surprisingly controversial in modern politics. Look at the data, because while immigration and crime have become inseparable in modern US politics, criminologists have been studying this relationship for decades. And what they found is quite different from what many politicians are telling you, particularly those on the political right. Today, we're examining one simple question. Are immigrants more likely to commit crime? And as you'll see, the answer is considerably more complicated and less dramatic than many people realize. Humans are terrible at understanding risk. We're great at remembering dramatic stories. We're terrible at remembering statistics. If an immigrant commits a horrific crime, it makes the headlines. However, even as millions of immigrants go about their daily lives without committing crimes and contributing positively to communities, that does not make headlines. Allow me to demonstrate.
This is facts, news, special alert.
Millions of immigrants continue living ordinary, law-abiding lives. See the difference? Because that's not a news story, it's every day. And unfortunately, our brains are much better at remembering the exception rather than the rule.
The numbers, what do they mean?
One statistic frequently cited in immigration debates comes from ICE. ICE reports the number of non-citizens who have criminal convictions, including homicide offenses. Homicide represents one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. In 2024, ICE recorded 29 homicide or manslaughter convictions involving a non-citizen. That year alone, the US had recorded 20,162 homicides, meaning non-citizens are involved in less than 1% of the total amount of homicides. However, this approach examines only raw numbers. If we're trying to determine whether immigrants are unusually crime-prone, we need comparisons rather than anecdotes. If crime statistics are boring, immigration enforcement is anything but. Over the past several years, ICE operations have become increasingly visible.
Authorities in Los Angeles County declaring a state of emergency over federal immigration raids. The declaration allows local officials to provide funding and assistance for families, workers, and small businesses impacted by ICE raids.
Federal agents in tactical gear, helicopters, armored vehicles, dramatic arrests. It's a visible spectacle, and that matters. A glitzy raid on the evening news becomes a must-see event. The result is that immigration enforcement often becomes associated with dangerous criminality, even when enforcement actions involve people whose primary violation is documentation, a civil offense. Enforcement itself has generated a controversy, and not just among immigration advocates. Federal immigration authorities have repeatedly argued that detention facilities are safe and humane. At the same time, journalists, attorneys, and advocacy groups have documented many deaths occurring in ICE custody. Questions have also emerged regarding detention conditions. In 2026, detainees at several detention facilities launched hunger strikes, alleging inhumane conditions. Federal officials disputed many of the allegations. Tom Homan publicly suggested there was no hunger strike occurring.
The Democratic politicians were lying. They're enticing these protests with their lies. I did go to the facility. There was never a hunger strike. There was, one person was threatening to start a hunger strike, but no one's on a hunger strike.
However, during the previous month, Holman had also stated,
"Look, I've done this since 1984. Hunger strikes never work. We're not going to change what we do because someone goes on a hunger strike. As a matter of fact, if it gets bad enough and the physicians feel like they're putting themselves in extreme danger, medical danger, then we'll force feed them. We'll get a court order and force feed them.
Now, those two statements create a fairly obvious question. If there isn't a hunger strike, who exactly are we force feeding? Now, one other elephant remains. Federal agents actually killed 2 U.S. citizens during Operation Metro Surge, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. The contradiction illustrates a broader issue. Immigration policy is often discussed through slogans, these headlines, and emotional narratives. And here's where things get awkward. Because if immigrants were truly driving crime in America, researchers should be finding evidence of it. Instead, study after study finds the opposite. Let's start with adolescents. In 2015, Salas Wright and colleagues analyzed nationally representative data on more than 25,000 adolescents. Their findings were striking. Immigrant youth were significantly less likely to engage in delinquency, violence, and drug misuse than their US-born peers. They were also more likely to report stronger parental relationships, greater school engagement, and more negative attitudes towards substance use. In other words, the stereotype of immigrant youth as uniquely prone to criminal behavior was not supported by the data. In fact, the researchers found evidence for something known as the immigrant paradox. Despite facing substantial social and economic challenges, immigrant youth often exhibit better behavior outcomes than their native-born counterparts, and that pattern continues past adolescence. One of the most influential studies on immigration and crime comes from Michael Light and colleagues. The researchers examined arrest records in Texas from 2012 through 2018. Importantly, they were able to compare US-born citizens, legal immigrants, and undocumented immigrants. Compared to undocumented immigrants, US-born citizens were more than twice as likely to be arrested for violent crimes, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes, and more than 4 times more likely to be arrested for property crimes. Let me repeat that for the birds in the back. The group most frequently blamed for rising crime had lower arrest rates across violent, property, and drug offenses. Researchers also found little evidence that undocumented immigrants were driving increases in crime over time, which means the data are pointing in a very different direction than the one often presented in political speeches. Maybe Texas is unusual. Maybe these findings only apply to recent immigrants. Fortunately, another team of researchers decided to examine that question. A study by Abram Miskey and colleagues examined incarceration patterns from 1870 through 2020. 150 years. Their conclusion? Immigrants have consistently exhibited lower incarceration rates than US-born Americans throughout virtually the entire period. Even more remarkable, immigrants today are substantially less likely to be incarcerated than native-born Americans. This pattern appears across multiple immigrant groups and historical periods, different countries of origins, different immigration policies, different economic conditions, same basic finding: lower incarceration rates. At some point, when 150 years of evidence keeps pointing in the same direction, it becomes difficult to dismiss. But then the story takes an interesting turn. Researchers have found that immigrant advantage tends to weaken across generations. First-generation immigrants generally have the lowest crime rates, but by the second generation, the differences largely disappear. In other words, immigrants don't remain different forever. Over time, they begin to resemble the broader society around them. Or put differently, the longer immigrant families are in America, the more American their crime rates become. So are immigrants more likely to commit crime? The evidence says no. That doesn't mean immigrants never commit crime. They do. Every population does. The question has never been whether crimes committed by immigrants exist. The question is whether immigrants commit more crime than native-born Americans. And after decades of criminological research, the answer remains very consistent. Immigrants are less likely to be arrested, less likely to be incarcerated, and less likely to engage in delinquent behavior than native-born population. Which means the real puzzle isn't why immigrants commit crime. The real puzzle is why so many Americans continue to believe They're uniquely responsible for it, because if the research tells us anything, it's that immigration debate may reveal less about crime itself and more about how fear, politics, and highly visible anecdotes shape our perception of reality. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support my work, hit subscribe, smash that like button, and comment what topic I should cover next.